Welcome back to this series on Brave New World. Over the last two chapters, we really saw the way the world state operates. Particularly, I noticed that most readers, the first time reading Brave New World, feel deeply uncomfortable with the way the world state conditions and manufactures human beings. There seems to be no sense of free will or choice within this world. You are conditioned from even before you are born to a specifically predestined role in society. Moreover, you have no sense of individuality as you are just one of 96 perfectly identical twins, and then your embryo is altered so that you will very much like whatever social role you end up getting. So at this point, we understand what the world state is and how it works, at least with regards to producing humans. But at this point, we don't really have a great justification for why the world state came into being or why it's doing this. We know they care about stability. We don't really understand how this came to be, though. Are the world state controllers just these evil villains who wanted to just take power and control the population? Or was there something different going on? And I think chapter 3, a really, really important chapter and a very artistically well done chapter, as it layers 3 different scenes on top of each other. I'm sure it was slightly confusing the first time that you were reading it, as you were trying to make sense of what scene you were looking at, especially towards the end of the chapter when it starts alternating scenes every line. Nevertheless, I think this chapter does a lot to deepen our appreciation for the world state, or at least to complicate the simple narrative that the world state is evil. There are mustache-twirling villains who are running the world state who just want power and to control the entire population. Instead, I think this chapter gives us robust justifications for the world state that make us really wonder, maybe the world state has some good reasons for existing. Maybe there's something to the world state, and we have to give it some credit or credence when evaluating whether or not we ultimately think it is bad by the end of the novel. So let's hop in. We're going to do some close reading. I'm going to be reading a lot from the text today. There's just Mustapha Mond in particular does such a good job of articulating so much of the world state that there's no getting around it. We have to look at the way that he articulates it. Just one quick characterization note. On page 33, we get a description of him in the middle of the page, and it says, "They looked around. On the fringe of the little group stood a stranger, a man of middle height, black hair, and a hooked nose, full red lips, eyes very piercing and dark." So if we think figuratively about eyes, of course are always linked to understanding. And so if the eyes are piercing, that means the person is typically incredibly intelligent. They're able to see and penetrate everything in terms of their understanding. And the fact that his eyes are very dark probably carry ominous or negative connotations, perhaps even evil. Now, again, I'm going to complicate the narrative that Mustapha Mond is just a purely evil, one-dimensional character. I think he's actually quite complex, one of the most complex characters within the novel. But certainly we can see just from this opening description that there are some negative associations linked to him. And so for the rest of this chapter, as you know, the director of hatcheries with this group of students that he was educating, Mustapha Mond kind of takes the mic and he starts explaining all of these aspects of the world state. And we find out very quickly that Mustapha Mond is a huge deal. He's a world controller. There's only 10 of these individuals in the entire world. So this is one of the most important people within the world, within the civilization. On page 34, we get a really interesting passage from Mustapha Mond where he starts talking about history. Towards the bottom of the page, he says, "You all remember," said the controller in his strong, deep voice. "You all remember, I suppose, that beautiful and inspired saying of our Fords?" So we're going to talk about why they keep coming back to Ford a little bit later in this chapter. He says, "History is bunk. History," he repeated slowly, "is bunk." So, okay, we got to ask ourselves, why does the world state want to detach from history so much? Let's keep reading. He waved his hand, and it was as though with an invisible feather whisk he had brushed away a little dust, and the dust was Harappa. So Harappa, very early civilization at the beginnings of civilized history, was of the Chaldees. Some spider webs, so same thing, early civilization in the Middle East. Some spider webs, and they were Thebes and Babylon. So just real quick, he's whisking away all these ancient civilizations, Thebes, Babylon, And notice the word choice there, spider webs. Spider webs, of course, are very fragile. I know the silk is actually quite strong, right? But in reality, right, it's very easy to whisk away a spider web for humans. And that's what Mustapha Mond is doing here with these great origin points of civilization. He says, whisk, whisk. And where was Odysseus? So obviously from Homer's The Odyssey, widely considered one of the most important early texts from ancient civilizations. Where was Job? So now we're at the Bible. Where was Jupiter? Now we're at the Romans. And Gautama, that's your boy, the Buddha, and Jesus. So notice the evolution of these various important figures, both literary and religious, and Mustapha Mond doesn't find them significant. He says whisk, and those specks of antique dirt called Athens and Rome, Jerusalem, and the Middle Kingdom, all were gone. Whisk, the place where Italy had been was empty. Whisk the cathedrals, whisk, whisk King Lear and the thoughts of Pascal, whisk passion, whisk requiem, whisk symphony, whisk. The last couple were references to famous composers and their works. So notice, I think when we look back at history and we think about the past, well, of course, there's a lot from the past that we want to detach from. There were a lot of prejudices and biases that we think were probably messed up, and we think it's good that we've left those in the dustbin of history. For instance, we think it's good, I'm guessing, that slavery doesn't exist anymore. We think it's good that the Nazi Party has been buried in history. Nevertheless, we look back at a lot of elements of history, and I think we can affirm it. We affirm Shakespeare. We affirm some of the great achievements of ancient civilizations, and we view that as part of our heritage. So we don't really get an incredible answer right now. We'll actually not get the full answer to why Mustapha Mond wants to completely detach from history until the very end of the novel in his debate with John the Savage, but it's an important point to note and to write down about the orientation and the attitudes of this society to the past. The world state represents a complete cleavage, a complete detachment from the past. It is totally in the world of modernity, as we have been defining modernity, about that increasing detachment from past sources of meaning. The next about 10 pages really start to establish the dangers of family, and Mustapha Mond talks about this a lot. This was something we saw in chapter 2 about the students feeling very uncomfortable with the concept like family or the concept like parents, and so Mustapha Mond here will do a very good job of articulating why. On page 36, top of the page, Mustapha Mond leaned forward, shook a finger at them. Just try to realize it, he said, and his voice sent a strange thrill quivering along their diaphragms. Try to realize what it was like to have a viviparous mother. That smutty word again. But none of them dreamed this time of smiling. Try to imagine what living with one's family meant. They tried, but obviously without the smallest success. And do you know what a home was? They shook their head. So again, we're going to get these other scenes spliced in here. I'm not going to talk about these scenes until the next video where I start to analyze the major characters of the novel. Right now, I just want to focus on Mustapha Mond. So on page 37, it says home, home. Mustapha Mond's continuing. A few small rooms stiflingly over-inhabited by a man, by a periodically teeming woman, by a rabble of boys and girls of all ages. No air, no space, an under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease, and smells. So we're getting at this idea. I think Mustapha Mond, obviously, you could read this just literally, that there wasn't a lot of space and families were confined in. But I think he's not speaking about the physical place itself. I think he is using metaphors here to describe families as a prison. I think a great text to think of in relationship to this would be The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. In that text, you get the sense of how suffocating family life is, about the dangers of having family around you and always having to live up to their expectations or to fulfill your duties and obligations to them, to make sure that you are well valued within the family. There's a lot that goes into a family that can feel very suffocating. Let's keep going. Bottom of the page on 37. And home was as squalid psychically as physically. Psychically, it was a rabbit hole, a midden hot with the frictions of tightly packed life reeking with emotion. What suffocating intimacies, what dangerous, insane, obscene relationships between the members of the family group. Maniacally, the mother brooded over her children, brooded over them like a cat over its kittens, but a cat that could talk, a cat that could say, my baby, over and over again. My baby, and oh, at my breast, that little hands, the hunger, and that unspeakable, agonizing pleasure. Till at last my baby sleeps with a bubble of white milk at the corner of his mouth. My baby sleeps. Yes, said Mustapha Mond, nodding his head. You may well shudder. So, okay, again, he's making this depiction of parents feel a little bit psychotic here. We can see that Mustapha Mond absolutely finds family life stifling and psychically dangerous. And probably what's been at the top of your mind, but Mustapha Mond articulates directly on page 39, is the connection to the thinker who very much articulated these ideas, Freud. So on page 39, towards the top of the page, it says, our Ford, or our Freud, as for some inscrutable reason he chose to call himself whenever he spoke of psychological matters, our Freud has been the first to reveal the appalling dangers of family life. So this is territory that we have discussed before. And if you're curious, if you forgot about it, I recommend going back to our video lecture on Freudian thought to really review this, because I think it is a good underpinning for Brave New World, because I think Brave New World, a lot of it is trying to respond to the distress that Freud saw as endemic to our existence within society and within families. In Freudian thought, family relationships always end up producing repression as we are trying to live up to certain expectations or fulfill our duties and obligations, and that almost always will evolve into neuroses of some kind, or suffering, or psychosis in the most extreme examples. I'm not going to review this in tremendous depth here, but think about how Brave New World solves many of the dilemmas that we saw in a text like Kafka's Metamorphosis, or think about how this text, or how the world state solves the dilemmas that, say, Hamlet was facing, where he felt such strong emotions about his father being murdered, about his mother remarrying. All those issues around the family go away within the world state. The world was full of fathers, I'm continuing now, was therefore full of misery, full of mothers, therefore, of every kind of perversion, from sadism to chastity, full of brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, full of madness and suicide. And yet, among the savages of Samoa and certain islands off the coast of New Guinea, the tropical sunshine lay like warm honey on the naked bodies of children tumbling promiscuously among the hibiscus blossoms. Home was in any one of the 20 palm-thatched houses. In the Trobian's conception was the work of ancestral ghosts. Nobody had ever heard of a father. So he's describing here indigenous people on the island of Samoa where they didn't have the concept of a family. Extreme, said the controller, meet, for good reason that they were made to meet. So it's clear that this model on the Samoan Islands served as a useful example for the world state in imagining a different type of society that didn't run into the suffocating problems of the family. Page 40, Mustapha Mond continues. Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, but there were also husband, wives, lovers. There was also monogamy and romance, though you probably don't know what those are, said Mustapha Mond. They shook their head. Family, monogamy, romance, everywhere exclusiveness, a narrow channeling of impulse and energy. I think that line is a really good line that describes, or is going to be an important internal link in Mustapha Mond's thought about why the family life and just relationships in general before the world state were so dangerous. Think about it. You cannot, or you don't go through your day with the same impulse and energy, with the same attitudes and feelings that you have, say, towards your best friends, towards your lovers, towards your family, as you do to just everybody else that you encounter. We think of that as being very difficult. Imagine if you're the person who served you your coffee, or the person at the grocery store, somebody that you cross or see crossing the street, if you had the same emotional attachment to them as you did to your family, to your friends. Well, obviously that would be impossible. That would be unsustainable. And so what the world state has done is just lowered that emotional attachment and spread it out. It is now diffuse, as opposed to narrowing or having a narrow channeling of your impulse and energy towards a very small number of people. It is instead diffuse that outwards so that everybody feels that they belong to everybody else. And we get that in the next line. But everyone belongs to everyone else, he concluded, citing the hypnopaetic proverb. The students nodded, emphatically agreeing with a statement which upwards of 62,000 repetitions in the dark had made them accept not merely as true, but as axiomatic, self-evident, utterly indisputable. Okay, 41. We get a great metaphor that will describe exactly why Mustapha Mond thinks family life is dangerous. So I think we're starting to get it. He says on 41, think of water under pressure in a pipe. So, okay, we should think about what this metaphor is. Water under pressure in a pipe. It builds, right? They thought of it. I pierce it once, said the controller. What a jet. So imagine, if you have water pressure buildup in a pipe, there's going to be a lot of pressure there. If you have one small hole, there's going to be an explosion. So this metaphor of water under pressure in a pipe, I think, absolutely has figurative associations of instability, violence, and explosion. And of course, Mustapha Mond is going to use this as a metaphor for what our relationships in our world are like. Think about it. Because of our strong attachments, that pressure that we have, that narrow channeling of our energy towards specific people, what happens if those people betray us? What happens if those people disappear from our lives? What happens if those people pass away? That causes tremendous emotional instability, tremendous emotional violence. And so we can see here why this is not good for social cohesion if we're channeling our energies towards specific people. He pierced it 20 times. There were 20 piddling little fountains. My baby, mother, the madness is infectious. My love, my one and only precious, precious. So notice here, he's really channeling, or he's capturing that idea of channeling one's emotions so strongly towards one person. A mother's love for her baby is the equivalent of water under pressure in a pipe having just one hole in it. Mother, monogamy, romance, high spurts, the fountain, fierce and foamy, the wild jet. The urge has but a single outlet. My love, my baby. No wonder these poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily, didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. What, with mothers and lovers? What, with the prohibitions they were not conditioned to obey? What, with the temptations and the lonely remorses? What, with all the diseases and the endless isolating pain? What, with the uncertainties and the poverty? They were forced to feel strongly, and feeling strongly, what was more in solitude and hopelessly individual isolation, how could they be stable? So this is a paragraph that really demands to be taken seriously. Because, of course, over chapter 1 and 2, we've been saying, oh God, the world state, that would be a nightmare. But this paragraph does a really good job. I think we can all relate to those feelings that he captured there, of all of the temptations, the feelings of loneliness, the diseases, the sense of isolation, the uncertainties, the poverty that exists in our world. Yeah, we feel more within our world because we get to make choices. We have to choose what career we're going to accept in our lives, as opposed to, just accepting whatever our predestined role was. But those feelings, Mustapha Mond seems to be arguing, are the result of instability, of suffering. That if we really want to experience or maximize our happiness, we should lower those things, or we should get rid of those things, and part of that would be doing away with the family. Really interesting thoughts that I think complicate and deepen and provide nuance and sophistication to this discussion. Page 42. Now we start to get to the justifications, and the metaphor that Mustapha Mond's going to come back to is the wheels turning. Now what's interesting is every other time I've talked about Brave New World and the wheels turning, we'll see this is about civilization just working. I had always talked about how the wheels in our lives have never stopped turning. We take so many things for granted, that food will be on the table, that we'll be able to go to the grocery store. Now, fortunately, for the most part, we still have food. Certainly, there have been increasing issues with hunger during the coronavirus pandemic. But for the most part, we still have food on our plates. But I think we all got to experience, or we all have been experiencing throughout 2020 and now 2021, what it's like when the wheels stop turning for a moment. And I think the feeling that we can most relate to were those opening weeks of the pandemic, when it hit the United States, when all of a sudden people were hoarding food, when people were hoarding toilet paper, where we didn't know what was going to happen. Some people were trying to go out and buy weapons. That was a moment that was really scary because people were preparing as if the wheels of civilization were going to stop turning. So let's go to 42 for evidence on this. Stability, said the controller. Stability. No civilization without social stability. No social stability without individual stability. His voice was a trumpet. Listening, they felt larger, warmer. So, okay, we know what Mustapha Mond's highest value is. It's social stability. He's going to come back to that and claim that that is the most essential thing that any civilization should focus on, and it should come before any other value that we care about, like our personal liberties. The machine turns and must keep turning forever. It is death if it stands still. So he's saying, if the machine stops turning, if food stops being delivered to grocery stores, if there's no more food on the grocery store shelves, if we start going hungry, civilization goes away. Give it about 90 hours of people not being able to find food, and I promise you, even the most seemingly stable of civilizations will fall. 1,000 million scrabbled the crust of the earth. The wheels began to turn. In 150 years, there were 2,000 millions. Stop all the wheels. In 150 weeks, there are once more only 1,000 millions. 1,000 men and women have starved to death. So what was he just describing right there? He was describing the vast history of humanity and our population growth because of the wheels turning and this machine spinning. And then he described a moment that we're going to learn about very soon here, where the wheels stopped turning and all of a sudden millions of people died. Wheels must turn steadily, but cannot turn untended. There must be men to tend them, men as steady as the wheels upon their axles, sane men, obedient men, stable in contentment. Crying, my baby, my mother, my only love, groaning, my sin, my terrible God, screaming with pain, muttering with fever, bemoaning old age and poverty, how can they tend the wheels? So notice the juxtaposition there. Mustapha Mond on the one hand giving us a very stable image of sane men, obedient men who are able to keep the wheels turning, and contrasting that with images from our own world of the psychoses that evolve, or the suffering and agony and turmoil that we experience in our own world. And if they cannot tend the wheels, the corpses of 1,000 men and women would be hard to bury or burn. So he's saying the instability within our own personal lives, those feelings that you get when you don't feel happy, when you feel sad, when you feel isolated, when you feel separate from people, when you feel that you haven't lived up to your parents' expectations, when you feel you haven't succeeded in school, when you feel tremendous stress and pressure because of the expectations and obligations that are being placed on you, all of that instability within yourself, Mustapha Mond says absolutely is dangerous because it can lead to the wheels not turning. Skip a paragraph. Stability, insisted the controller. Stability. The primal and ultimate need. Stability. Hence all of this. With a wave of his hand, he indicated the gardens, the huge building of the conditioning center, the naked children furtive in the undergrowth or running across the lawns. So again, Mustapha Mond is going to come back to this. Go down to the bottom of this page, 43, and Mustapha Mond continues. Impulse arrested spills over, and the flood is feeling, the flood is passion, the flood is even madness. It depends on the force of the current, the height and strength of the barrier. The unchecked stream flows smoothly down its appointed channels in a calm well-being. The embryo is hungry. Day in, day out, the blood surrogate pump unceasingly turns its 800 revolutions a minute. The decanted infant howls. At once a nurse appears with a bottle of external secretion. Feeling lurks in that interval of time between desire and its consummation. Okay, this is a really, really important line. So Mustapha Mond started to explain how we all have impulses, we all have desires. And what's dangerous is if those impulses or feelings build up and begin to spill over. That's instability. If you felt lonely for too long, you'll become unstable. If you have really wanted, a lover, but you just can't get anybody, you're going to start to become unstable. If you've been trying to live up to the expectations of your teachers and parents and you just feel that you're falling short, that feeling is going to spill over. But what Mustapha Mond says is feeling, what I'm describing here, really just exists in the interval of time between desire and its consummation. So you have a desire. How long does it take for you to fulfill that? If you can minimize that, look at this next line, shorten that interval, break down all those old unnecessary barriers. So if you can get rid of that interval between you having a desire for, say, a lover, you having a desire for a delicious meal, or you have a desire to not feel lonely, insert whatever that desire is. If you can break down the time between when you get that desire and how long it takes to achieve that, then you can get rid of this flood or this water pipe bursting that Mustapha Mond is discussing. Fortunate boys, said the controller, no pains have been spared to make your lives emotionally easy, to preserve you so far as it is possible from having emotions at all. So the controller here is saying, listen, we've been able to make your lives perfectly happy by making it so that you don't have to have these strong feelings. And he says, Flords in his flivver, so a flivver is like a car, murmured the DHC, all's well with the world. So this is a perversion of the religious phrase, God is in heaven, all is right in the world. And that's a phrase that is meant to imply that everything is good. And so absolutely it's the same idea, right? Ford's in his flivver, Ford's in his car, so all is well in the world. It's a sense that everything is in the right place. And so that is what's being communicated here, that this removal of time between one's desires and its consummation is a sign that everything is right in the world. Page 45, Mustapha Mond continues. Consider your own lives, said Mustapha Mond. Has any of you ever encountered an insurmountable obstacle? The question was answered by a negative silence. Has any of you ever been compelled to live through a long time interval between the consciousness of a desire and its fulfillment? Well, began one of the boys and hesitated. Speak up, said the DHC. Don't keep his Fordship waiting. I once had to wait nearly 4 weeks before a girl I wanted would let me have her. And have you felt a strong emotion in consequence? Horrible. Horrible precisely, said the controller. Our ancestors were so stupid and short-sighted that when the first reformers came along and offered to deliver them from those horrible emotions, they wouldn't have anything to do with them. So, okay, we're about to get to the obstacles to social stability. Obviously, the main one that Mustapha Mond has been articulating is human suffering and the inability to fulfill desire. This is what he articulated in this passage, and we're about to learn more about this. But think about this. Again, don't just resist Mustapha Mond's statement as saying, Brave New World, this world state is a nightmare. But instead, try to take his statement seriously and really ask yourself, how would you robustly refute what he is saying? So, let's keep going, and we're going to learn more about these obstacles on page 46. And he's articulating that even though this world state would actually solve all the primal needs and desires of individuals, people were resistant. And so let's look at historically why this resistance happened. And I actually really appreciate that in this text, it's not like, and then an evil social class took over and they implemented their will on everybody. We're actually going to see that there is acquiescence from individuals. They buy into the world state. So, page 46, it says, take ectogenesis. Fitzner and Kawaguchi had got the whole technique worked out. But would the governments look at it? No. There was something called Christianity. Women were forced to go on being viviparous. So he's saying even though we were starting to make advancements, people wouldn't buy it. So Christianity forms an obstacle, or just religion in general. Go to the bottom of the page. Again, I think his critique of religion is that it's steeped in tradition. It's not reasonable. It's not rational. It just has these dumb biases that prevent us from actually achieving utopian visions. Bottom of the page on 46, it says sleep teaching was actually prohibited in England. There was something called liberalism. Parliament, if you know what that was, passed a law against it. The records survive. Speeches about liberty of the subject. Liberty to be inefficient and miserable. Freedom to be a round peg in a square hole. Those are powerful lines because Mustapha Mond is probably attacking some of the values that you would feel most strongly about, right? Liberalism is a political ideology that argues that the nation exists to protect the rights of individuals. People's rights. Look at the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Absolutely, the United States of America is a great example of this. We believe in the importance of liberty, of freedom, but notice what Mustapha Mond is saying here. This was an obstacle to actually achieving what our true primal desires are for the satisfaction of pleasure and happiness. And he says liberty really just is a way to be inefficient and miserable. Freedom ultimately is just a way to not fulfill what we really want to become, to be a round peg in a square hole, something that doesn't quite fit. Page 47, second section there, it says, or the caste system. So remember, the Brave New World has a explicitly defined hierarchy that's very rigid. Constantly proposed, constantly rejected. There was something called democracy, as though men were more than physiochemically equal. Again, Mustapha Mond's mocking the idea that all people are actually equal. Yeah, physically, chemically, maybe, but in society, there needs to be a hierarchy, he's saying. Skip down a couple lines, he says, then the 9 Years' War began in AF 141. So we get the sense that the calendar years have completely changed here, and so we're going to have to ask about that. But let's look at the 9 Years' of War and what happens. So next section, he starts listing all of these chemicals, and yeah, you guessed it, these are poison gases, biochemical warfare. He's describing biochemical warfare that was used in the 9 Years' War. So we have to imagine Huxley was projecting outwards. He had just experienced World War I. Remember, he published the text in 1932. Biochemical warfare was used in World War I. It was the most destructive war. And so Huxley must have been imagining what future wars were going to look like. And if those trends continued, well, they were going to be even more destructive and horrific. Bottom of the page, he says, the noise of 14,000 airplanes advancing in open order. But in the Kurfürstendamm and the English arrondissement, the explosion of the anthrax bombs is hardly louder than the popping of a paper bag. Again, anthrax is a form of biological warfare. Next little section, he gives us a chemical equation. Now we're on 48. And he says, what does that equal? An enormous hole in the ground, a pile of masonry, some bits of flesh and mucus, a foot with the boot still in it, flying through the air and landing, flop in the middle of the geraniums. The scarlet one, such a splendid show that summer. Skip down to the next little section. It says, the Russian technique for infecting water supplies was particularly ingenious. Next, skip that next line. The 9 Years' War, the great economic collapse, there was a choice between world control and destruction, between stability and he's cut off, but I presume he was going to say liberalism. So we're getting the sense here that the 9 Years' War, really destroyed or pushed humanity to the brink of complete civilizational collapse. This is something that the world was absolutely going to experience in World War II. Right, the wheels stopped turning in World War II. Food wasn't getting to everyone's tables. People were being thrown in concentration camps. So many people died. Civilization and its laws and orders broke down in many places where the war was raging most vehemently. Bombs were flying overhead and indiscriminately mowing down entire cities. That's a good example of the wheels stopping turning. And we are getting a depiction here of the 9 Years' War. So it is out of that vast instability, vast destruction, mass forms of death that the world state is born. And so notice the world state, again, isn't about evil villains taking over and imposing their will just as a mad power grab. It's about really trying to solve these problems of instability that were plaguing the 20th century in particular, but obviously this fictional world as well. And on the top of page 49, we get a really important line. He says, liberalism, of course, was dead of anthrax. But all the same, you couldn't do things by force. So, what does he mean liberalism was dead of anthrax? Liberalism isn't a biological being that exists. It can't die. But he's saying the idea of liberalism was destroyed because of the vast amount of instability that existed because of it. Because of liberalism, because people were allowed to make choices and not just be conditioned by the world state, we were led to a situation where a 9 Years' War killed hundreds of millions of people. I think it was thousands of millions, where there was a great economic collapse, where people were starving, where there was biochemical warfare used against civilians. And so over the next couple pages, Mustapha Mond describes how, bit by bit, the world state was able to come into formation, and how people, initially resisted it, but by the end, they were able to convince other people to buy into it. So towards the bottom of page 50, that second to last little paragraph, he says, in the end, said Mustapha Mond, the controllers realized that force was no good. The slower but infinitely surer method of ectogenesis, neo-Pavlovian conditioning, and hypnopaedia. Now skip to the top of page 51. The discoveries of Pfitzner and Kawaguchi were at last made use of, an intensive propaganda against viviparous reproduction. Skip the next section. Accompanied by a campaign against the past, by the closing of museums, the blowing up of historical monuments. Luckily, most of them had already been destroyed during the 9 Years' War, by the suppression of all books published before AF 150. So we can see here the beginning of the world state conditioning people. But notice that the prerequisite to this even becoming a compelling option, period, was the destructiveness of the 9 Years' War. Skip the next line. It says, there were some things called pyramids, for example. Skip the next line. It says, and a man called Shakespeare. You never heard of them, of course. Skip the line. It says, such are the advantages of a really scientific education. The pyramids, Shakespeare, these are things that we typically hold up on a pedestal from the past, but Mustapha Mond saying you're lucky that you don't have to be exposed to them. Page 52, at the very top of the page, it says the introduction of our Ford's first T model. This is a great moment to just stop and think about, okay, why Ford and why the T model? Well, I would argue it's a good symbol of scientific advancement, of mass production, of economic efficiency, of conformity. Ford was the first one to really start mass producing cars, and he was able to do it because he could create a model and then mass produce it. So it's the same way. The world state uses those same techniques to produce people, and so it becomes a very good model for the entire world state. Skip the line. It says, chosen as the opening date of the new era. So just by the way, it's going to be basically every other line is where Mustapha Mond comes in. I'm going to stop saying skip a line. It's getting a little annoying, I'm sure, but you should be able to follow along. So it says, chosen as the opening date of the new era, there was a thing, as I've said before, called Christianity, the ethics and philosophy of underconsumption. Think about Christianity, right? Jesus explicitly says in the Gospels that those who focus on acquiring wealth and material goods within this world will have a smaller chance of getting into heaven. The emphasis on Christianity or in Christianity is on your spiritual salvation, not your material well-being. Mustapha Mond continues, he says, so essential when there was underproduction, but in an age of machines and the fixation of nitrogen, positively a crime against humanity, or against society. All crosses had their tops cut and became T's. There was also a thing called God. We have the world state now. In Ford's days, celebrations and community sings and solidarity services. So they've replaced religion. They've done away with religion. And instead, they've replaced it with the values and the ideology of the world state. Now on page 53, there was a thing called heaven, but all the same, they used to drink enormous quantities of alcohol. So he's showing some of the instability of the pre-world state world. There was a thing called the soul and a thing called immortality, but they used to take morphia and cocaine. 2,000 pharmacologists and biochemists were subsidized in AF 178. 6 years later, it was being produced commercially, the perfect drug. And this brings us to Soma, which is so important in this novel. He says, euphoric, narcotic, pleasantly hallucinant. So let's look at these. A euphoric drug stimulates your nervous system, so it makes you feel more, typically feel pleasure. That could be like MDMA or Molly. Narcotic makes you feel less. It depresses your nervous system, so that numbs you. That would be like opiates. And then pleasantly hallucinogenic is a hallucinogen alters your perception of reality. Something like, LSD or marijuana. So combine all those three things, and you got a pretty nice cocktail. Go to page 54. He says all the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of the defects. He says, take a holiday from reality whenever you like and come back without so much as a headache or a mythology. And then he says stability was practically assured. So this should make sense to us now based on everything he has said. If instability emerges when individuals are incapable of fulfilling their desires, or there's too long of a time between when that desire emerges and when they're able to fulfill it. If we are ultimately full of suffering and that because of our inability to fulfill all of our desires, and that instability oftentimes spills over into things like the 9 Years' War, where we have economic collapse and mass starvation and war and murder, and then the best way to assure stability would be to create something like Soma, which would perfectly make us happy all of the time. He says, it only remained to conquer old age. He says, gonadal hormones, transfusion of young blood, magnesium salts, all the physiological, so now we're on 55, all the physiological stigmata of old age have been abolished. And along with them, of course, along with them all the old man's mental peculiarities. Characters remain constant throughout a whole lifetime. Work, play, at 60, our powers and tastes are what they were at 17. Old men in the bad old days used to renounce, retire, take to religion, spend their days reading, thinking. Now, such is progress. The old men work, the old men copulate, the old men have no time, no leisure from pleasure, not a moment to sit down and think, or if ever, by some unlucky chance, such a crevice of time should yawn in the solid substance of their distractions, there's always Soma. Delicious Soma. Half a gram for a half holiday, a gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous east, 3 for a dark eternity on the moon, returning once they find themselves on the other side of the crevice, safe on the solid ground of daily labor and distraction, scampering from feely to feely, from girl to pneumatic girl, from electromagnetic golf course to... And so we see here that Mustapha Mond's articulation of Soma and this civilization is that people, yeah, sure, you don't have Shakespeare, you don't have these great achievements from the past, perhaps, you don't have all these incredible things that we would typically want to hold up on a pedestal, like, say, our liberties or our rights, but look at the way we get to live. We no longer have to deal with any of these issues that we had been describing, all the forms of suffering and agony and turmoil or inabilities to fulfill our desires. The world state absolutely answers that. And so I think a very important concept from this chapter is the idea that in order to achieve social stability, according to Mustapha Mond, you need to get rid of the problem of human suffering, the inability to fulfill desire. As long as there's individual instability on the level of suffering, then there will always be social stability. Now, what goes away with that are the things that produce very strong emotions. Remember, he said feeling emerges from that time interval between when we have a desire and when we're capable of achieving it. And so, yeah, we don't get Shakespeare anymore. We don't get great works of art. We don't get freedom. We don't get our liberties. But doing away with all those things allows us to have something that perhaps we'd much prefer: stability and happiness. No more of this suffering and agony. So that concludes chapter 3. Again, we didn't look at the sections of both Lenina and Bernard Marx. I'm going to start talking about those folks in the next video, where I start to analyze and trace the major characters and their conflicts within the novel. But these first 3 videos hopefully did a good job of capturing what the world state is, how it conditions and manufactures humans, and most importantly, what the justifications for this world state are. I think it's really easy in chapter 1 and 2 to just say the world state is messed up, man. I would never want to be within that world. I think chapter 3 begins to force us to think much more critically about whether or not we actually agree with the justifications of the world state. Even though our gut impulse is to say that's messed up, is that just our prejudice? Are we just blinded by our own ideology within our own society? Once we start critically thinking about the world state, do you agree that the minimization of suffering and the maximization of happiness and stability should be our highest value? If so, hopefully you can see why the world state and why Mustapha Mond's arguments actually hold a lot more water than you probably gave them credit for at a first glance. Now, for the next 10 or maybe 13 chapters, we're going to see all the characters and their conflicts. But we'll come back to these ideas again at the end of the novel when Mustapha Mond and John the Savage have their big debate. But these are important ideas that Huxley has planted. And notice it took him 3 chapters just to show us what the world state was. And I think it's actually quite effective, even though it doesn't jump into the protagonists and their conflicts right away, even though it might be a little bit more difficult to get the plot going at first. I think this is really, really important work on the level of ideas. And he is planting so many seeds that are really going to get us to question some fundamental values. So next time, we'll take a look at Bernard Marx and Lenina and some of the other characters within Brave New World. We'll start to see their relationship to the world state, how they react to it, and what ideas they represent, before tracing their eventual conflicts as they meet John the Savage and build up to that final debate of the novel.